Well, it's almost here. We've journeyed together another Advent season, doing our best to prepare our hearts and minds for another birthing of God in our lives and in our world. It is not a one and done event, or at least it shouldn't be. And as we've been blessed to begin another church year, Advent begins the liturgical calendar. As we leave Advent, we'll celebrate Christmas together on Tuesday night and perhaps with family and friends on Wednesday. And then we'll move right into the season of Epiphany, and that'll lead us to Lent. This morning we lit the candle of joy. And this last Sunday of Advent calls us to identify the yearning in our hearts for joy. And yet, if we're totally honest, many of us find this last focus of our Advent journey to be difficult. In the last 3 Sundays, we've talked about our yearnings for love and spent our Sunday at home thinking about peace. Came back after the weather cleared and last Sunday talked about hope. And now we arrive to the idea of joy in our lives. Did you have a chance to read the newspaper this morning? Or yesterday morning? Or any morning? Maybe you had the opportunity to turn on the morning news or check Facebook posts. This week on Facebook, in between the opinions about Duck Dynasty, I actually saw a post from someone that said, if you haven't watched the news this morning, don't. It's full of people hurting one another. Whether we're reading newspapers, watching or listening to news, or keeping up with Facebook posts, joy is sometimes difficult to find. Sure, we see an occasional positive story, but in truth, they're often tucked away into the back pages of a magazine or a brief snippet on network news offerings. All around us, we see destruction of lives, people broken and lonely, folks camping out all night for tickets to food pantries and used toy lines, relationships strained, poverty, oppression, and discrimination, natural disasters, political turmoil, painful and anxiety-filled medical diagnosis, and uncertain financial futures. Where is the joy? Where is it? Our lectionary reading for today is Romans 1:1-7, and I don't know if you noticed it or not when Harris read it, but it really doesn't have much substance to it. Or so it seems. It is, after all, 7 verses of a long, drawn-out salutation from Paul to the church in Rome, a church that he had never visited. This was late in Paul's ministry, but there was a lot going on in Rome. And to be sure, because Paul did not have a personal experience with him, it's a good bet that some of the believers in Rome didn't trust him. Yet amidst political, social, and religious unrest that surrounded that ancient community, Paul wanted to give them some advice. And our lectionary organizers thought the advice was well suited to Advent. We might relate to the folks in ancient Rome, for their world was also in disarray. What then might this extended salutation offer to them and to us? In reading and studying this scripture over the past month or so, one word kept standing out, almost at times lifting itself off the page. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called. To all God's beloved in Rome who are called, including yourselves who are called. This word, called. Perhaps, I thought, just perhaps, joy is found amidst difficulty and distress when we can somehow discern God's call. and then get the courage or energy to follow it. We didn't read it aloud this morning, but another one of our lectionary readings today was from Matthew 1:18 to 25. I was tempted to preach on it because it was also the reading last year for our series, and I already had a sermon. The back of our bulletin today has a good reflection from that reading. In the story from Matthew, Joseph's impending joy of engagement to Mary is destroyed when he finds out that she is pregnant, and not by him. Yet Joseph heard God's call to marry her anyway and to father this child Mary was carrying. His joy then was in following God's call, not necessarily the circumstances surrounding the birth event. And then in our reading from Romans, Paul had covered a lot of ground. Most of us are all too familiar with Paul's journey to Christianity. Suffice it to say, Paul had an amazing conversion experience, but at one time, Paul was considered among the worst of the worst in persecuting believers. I mean, he wasn't just intolerant. He was actively killing and torturing early Christians. And the first listeners of Paul's letters would have known this history. So it seemed important for Paul to use an extending opening to his letter to the church in Rome to convince them to read further, to listen more intently. And his catch, seems to me it was this word called. As Paul's letter continues beyond our reading this morning, he expresses the joy he has found in serving God. And for Paul, that service was found by following the example of Jesus. Now make no mistake, Paul was like a former smoker who is extremely intolerant of smoking. Once Paul converted to Christianity, he strongly believed it to be the only path to God. So truth be told, he and I would have had some theological discussion and perhaps disagreements, particularly as related to my openness to other paths to God. But that's a sermon for another day. But here is what I do share with Paul. I believe that true joy in our lives is found when we determine what our calling is, and then we follow it. Now trust me, that does not mean that once we find our calling, life goes any smoother. In fact, very often it's the opposite. Following God's call disrupts our life oftentimes. It makes it more challenging. It gets in the way of the normal flow. Paul was imprisoned numerous times. He was discarded by his former family and friends. He was disbarred from the religious community he once belonged to. He had some success with starting churches, but usually soon after he left them, they commenced to arguing and splitting, and he had to regroup them. So life was far from easy for Paul. Yet he continues in letter after letter to church after church, speaking of the joy in serving God. Friday before last, I spent 3 hours back in the pastor's office chatting with a young woman who had emailed me several weeks ago. Here's the email I initially received from her. My name is, and I'm a 5th-year senior at UK. I'm a lesbian and have been in a loving relationship with my girlfriend for over a year. I was raised in the Christian faith, which is the reason it took me so long to come out to myself and to others. I tried for 6 years to pray my thoughts and feelings away because I had been told all my life that God didn't make people that way. I finally felt after 6 years of prayer, dating men, and pouring myself into my faith that God was telling me enough was enough. I feel as though the message that day was, stop asking me to change that part of you. That's who I made you to be. I started accepting myself, and I began to come out to my friends and family in 2011. By this point, I had been accepting of myself for about a year. The problem is that I kept hearing things in the church that made me feel guilty, shameful, and just downright miserable to be who I am. I could no longer stand to hear those things, so I walked away from the church and from my faith because I felt that maybe that's not what God had been telling me. Since then, I've looked at other faiths, but I've always come back to the faith I was raised in, hoping to make peace with it. The problem is that I keep having conversations with people who sugarcoat their disapproval and remind me of the guilt and shame period of my life. I've been told that Satan is deceiving me, that I've been ensnared by him. I've been told that even if I re-accepted Christ, I couldn't have grace or salvation because I would be choosing sin above God. I've been told that I'm choosing to be this way. And then if I just knew God's love more fully, that I wouldn't be like this. I've heard this repeatedly. I heard it today, in fact, when I made the decision to talk with someone from the Christian Student Fellowship. I came home sobbing. And then I ended up here, sitting on my pre-furnished couch, on my laptop, writing to a pastor I've never met before. I don't know what answers you can give me, but it's got to be better than the answers I've heard before. I've heard about you and your church through a friend. I would like to visit, but I don't want to be told to change who I am. I don't think I can take hearing that anymore. I really love what Gandhi said. I like your Christ, not your Christians. I feel like I'm trapped, that I have nowhere I can really turn, and I desperately want to find a solution. So I guess my point of this whole message was to ask you, how can I possibly reconcile my faith, which is a choice, with my sexuality, which is not a choice? This bright, sincere young woman sat in my office looking for joy amidst desperation. I would envision some folks that saw some news and Facebook posts this week are just as desperate. She asked me some tough questions. I told her a bit of my story, and I told her that until I answered this call to ministry, I didn't have complete inner joy. I had a good life. I had a comfortable life surrounded with friends and family, a good job, and a nice home. There was something missing. And I discerned that something as I was grieving the overdose death of my nephew, Jim Doug, in January of 2005. God was calling me to ministry, and had been for some 20 years. But I had allowed life to drown out that call. I began to take steps, entering seminary, going through the extensive process of being ordained. Check and check. I thought then that I'd do pulpit supply around town, maybe some relief chaplaincy. That would allow me to do my ministry and continue in my comfortable life with weekends off. And the call continued. Start a new UCC church. God, I don't know what I'm doing. I haven't even pastored before, much less start a church. It's not easy. It's not comfortable. It doesn't keep personal challenges away from me or prevent curveballs from hitting me hard. Yet there is joy in my heart this morning. I love ministry. Not because it's easy or convenient or I'm good at it, but because in my gut it is my calling. For whatever reason, and I question it sometimes, for whatever reason, God called me to do this, to be in this place, at this church, at this time. After I finished sharing with my new friend, she asked another question. Pastor, how do you know it's God calling? To be sure, lots of folks claim God is speaking to them with vastly different viewpoints. There would be a quick line to form out here saying that I was very mistaken. God certainly would not call a woman to preach, and for sure a gay woman. It's not easy. Maybe that's why with Paul and me, and maybe you, the call we experience is a long time a-coming. The Damascus Road experience of Paul's was one focal point in a long journey of discernment. And my call was over 30 years. Yours? To be sure, the listening process is ongoing, and we're in a better position to hone in on our calling if we're open to how God has spoken in generations before us and how God continues to speak here and now. We will begin putting our decorations away next week. Some already have been put away last night. But Christmas is not one and done. Advent yearnings of peace and hope and love and joy don't go away as boxes are packed and stored until next year. And discerning God's call is a continuing journey as life's circumstances change. But it is a journey worth taking. It is a journey that once you answer the call, there is joy, not always with the circumstances, but joy that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing in the place you're called to do it at the time God needs you for the task. And no matter what else is going on in the world or in your life, there's that hint of joy that lies in wait. So where is the joy in our world? In your life? In our church? Where is it? In the midst of all the broken dreams and misplaced priorities, joy is found in answering God's call. It's where our yearnings for hope, love, peace, our yearnings for justice, inclusion, and acceptance, the God who put those yearnings within us, calls us this Advent season to meet face to face the promised one, Emmanuel. Emmanuel, within our hearts, the yearning to hear your call, to answer, to listen over and over again. Here's a follow-up email that I received at 1:59 this morning. I really enjoyed our chat the other day. It was very insightful and also very helpful. I appreciate your candidness and openness. It was refreshing to feel as though someone in the church understood where I was coming from. You really know your congregation well. It was wonderful to hear about the various members of your church. I walked away hopeful that I could find my way back to a connection with whatever or whomever created me. A friend of mine, a pastor's kid, invited me to watch her sing at her father's church on Sunday for the Christmas service. I'd attended the church a time or two before, And after my conversation with you, I decided I would accept her invitation and try again. I'd love to chat with you again sometime. I think I could learn a lot from you. I talked with my girlfriend about our discussion, and she agreed to come with me to Bluegrass when I return from Christmas break. I hope it's casual. I don't have many dressy clothes. I greatly appreciate you taking time to talk with me and walk with me. I didn't expect you to spare 3 hours of your time. That was very kind. I wish you, your wife, and your church a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Yearning for love, peace, hope, and joy. Yearning for a relationship and journey with a community and with the one who came to us as a baby boy. Yearning.